The sky over Port Remorse was the color of a bruise, a deep and angry purple that bled into a black horizon. It was the summer of 2002, and the Atlantic was churning, a restless beast sensing the storm that was coiling itself in the deep waters, preparing to strike. In a small, weather-beaten house on the edge of town, a house that always smelled of salt and damp wool, three sisters were getting ready for bed. There was Eleanor, the eldest. At 17, she carried the world on her shoulders, a seriousness to her eyes that came from being the stand-in mother since their own had passed. Then there was Clara, 15, a dreamer with wild, curly hair and a laugh that sounded like the crash of small waves, full of mischief and light. And finally, Margot, just 11, the baby of the family, with a quiet, watchful nature and a habit of collecting smooth stones from the beach, which she kept in a tin box under her bed. They were the Walker sisters, and they were the heartbeat of that small, hardscrabble fishing town. Their father, Elias Walker, was a fisherman, a man whose hands were as calloused and cracked as the hull of his boat. He had been widowed for 5 years, and the grief had settled into his bones, making him a quiet, distant presence. He loved his daughters with a fierce, protective silence, but the love was a fortress he couldn't leave. He built his life around the sea's rhythm, an existence that would soon be shattered by the very element he served. The storm was forecast to be the worst in a decade. A low-pressure system had been stalking the coast for days, and by the evening of July 14th, the wind had begun to howl, a low, mournful sound that seeped through the cracks of the old house. The electricity flickered, plunging the girls' bedroom into a rhythm of light and shadow. Eleanor was reading a worn-out copy of Jane Eyre to Clara and Margot, her voice a steady anchor against the rising chaos outside. It was a ritual, a sacred tradition that had begun after their mother's death. The stories were their shelter. "Don't go out there," Eleanor said, her eyes flicking from the book to the window, where the rain was starting to lash against the glass in horizontal sheets. "It's getting worse," Clara scoffed, pulling a blanket tighter around her shoulders. "We're not leaving, Elle. We're just reading." She loved to tease her older sister, to poke at that protective bubble Eleanor tried so hard to maintain. Margot was quiet, her small fingers tracing the pattern on her quilt. She was listening, but not to the story. She was listening to the storm. It felt different, she would say later to the investigators, though no one ever believed her. It felt angry. It felt alive. Downstairs, Elias was tying down the last of the deck furniture, a futile act against the power of the oncoming hurricane. The wind tore the tarp from his hands, sending it spiraling into the night. He cursed under his breath, a prayer to a god he hadn't spoken to since his wife's funeral, and went back inside. He checked the locks on the doors, the old, stiff locks that hadn't been replaced in decades. He looked at the stairs, where the muffled sounds of his daughters' voices drifted down. It was 10:47 p.m. when he heard the knock. It wasn't a frantic knock, but a solid, deliberate one. The kind that told you it wasn't a neighbor looking for shelter. Elias opened the door, and the storm seemed to pause for a moment, the wind holding its breath. On his doorstep stood a stranger. A man. The rain poured off the brim of a dark hat, obscuring his face. He wore a long, black coat that was completely drenched. He had a box tucked under his arm, a square wooden box, about the size of a large book. "Are you Elias Walker?" The man's voice was low, almost lost in the howl of the wind. "Yes," Elias replied, his hand instinctively tensing on the doorframe. "This is for your daughter," the man said, thrusting the box toward him. "A delivery. It's urgent." Elias, confused and suspicious, took the box. It was heavier than he expected, with an odd, metallic coldness to it. "For which daughter? At this hour? Who are you?" But the man was already turning away, melting back into the rain and the darkness. "Just give it to her," the voice drifted back, barely audible. Elias slammed the door, his heart hammering. The box was plain, made of dark, aged wood, with a tarnished brass lock on the front. There was no key. He shook it, and it didn't rattle. He examined it, turning it over in his hands, and a strange, unsettling feeling crept over him. It was just a box. But it felt like a harbinger. He took it upstairs, a strange weight in his hands that had nothing to do with its actual mass. The girls were in the hallway, drawn by the sound of the front door. They saw the box in his hands, and their faces were a mix of curiosity and concern. "Someone brought this. For one of you," Elias said, his voice gruff. He placed it on the small table in the hallway. The three sisters gathered around it, their reflections shimmering in the brass lock. It was a puzzle, a locked box with no key, delivered in the middle of a hurricane by a man who vanished into the night. Clara, fearless as ever, reached out and touched the lid. It was ice cold. "Who sent it?" Margot whispered. "There was no message," Elias replied, his eyes fixed on the box. "No key." The storm outside raged with renewed fury, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. And in that moment, their attention was split between the mystery of the box and the chaos of the world outside. It was the strangest, most unsettling coincidence. An hour later, the storm took a turn for the worse. The wind was a relentless, screaming demon that rattled the windows and shook the house. The power died completely, plunging the world into an absolute, all-consuming blackness. Elias tried to call down to the Coast Guard station, but the phone lines were dead. In the dark, the three sisters decided to get some water from the kitchen. They were together, that much is certain. Eleanor's hand was on the banister, Clara was a few steps behind, and Margot was just getting out of bed. Elias was in the living room, trying to start a fire in the dead hearth with damp wood. Then, there was a sound that cut through the screaming wind. A sound of wood splintering. A crash. It came from the direction of the kitchen. Elias snapped to his feet and rushed out of the living room, a frantic cry in his throat. "Eleanor, Clara, Margot." His voice was swallowed by the storm. He fumbled through the pitch-black house to the kitchen, and the sight that met his eyes was one he would never forget, a tableau of horror seared into his memory forever. The back door, the heavy oak door they had locked and double-bolted, was hanging from its hinges, swinging violently in the storm. The wind was howling into the house, tearing at the curtains and scattering papers. The room was a wreck, but the kitchen was empty. He called out their names again, his voice a raw, panicked scream. He searched the house, every room, every closet, the basement, the attic. The storm had drowned out his pleas. The silence that had been filled with the sounds of his daughters' lives was now a void. They were gone. The three sisters had vanished. One moment, they were in the house, in the middle of a hurricane. The next, they were gone. The only clue, the only tangible piece of evidence left behind, was the locked wooden box, sitting innocently on the hallway table, its brass lock glinting in the light of Elias's flickering lantern. The investigation began the moment the storm lifted, just a few hours later. The town of Port Remorse was a ghost town, battered and bruised, shuttered windows and collapsed roofs. The first investigator on the scene was a young detective named Thomas Reinhardt. He was new to the force, a city boy who had taken the job in the small coastal town for a quieter life. He found nothing quiet about what awaited him. The house was a disaster. The storm damage was severe, but something was off. Detective Reinhardt was meticulous, his instincts sharp. He noted the condition of the back door. The frame was shattered, but the splintered wood wasn't just from the outside force of the storm. There were marks on the door, what looked like gouges, as if something had been trying to pry it open from the outside. But the storm had been so powerful, it could have been debris. It could have been anything. He interviewed Elias Walker, a broken man whose world had been ripped apart. Elias told him about the stranger, the delivery, the box. He had moved it, he said. When the storm and his panic had subsided, he had put it in the basement, unable to bear the sight of it. The box was a focus for his fear, a symbol of the night's malevolence. Reinhardt retrieved the box. It was just as Elias had described. Dark, aged wood, a tarnished brass lock, no key. It was the only thing out of place. The girls had left all their belongings. Their clothes, their shoes, Eleanor's book still open on the page she'd been reading from. Margot's stone collection was still under her bed. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no signs of forced entry beyond the back door. The town of Port Remorse is a tiny, isolated community. On a clear day, you can see the lighthouse at the tip of the cape. But on the night of July 14th, the island effectively became a prison. There was no way on or off the island in that storm. The ferry, the only connection to the mainland, wasn't running. If the girls were taken, they had to be somewhere on the island. Or they had left of their own accord. But how, and why? The official theory, the one that was quietly muttered in the town hall and at the local diner, was that the girls had been swept away. A tragic accident. A wall of water from the storm surge could have burst through the back door and snatched them out to sea. It was the simplest explanation, and the one that hurt the least. The town needed to move on. They needed a clean ending. Detective Reinhardt wasn't convinced. There were too many questions. Who was the man with the box? Why deliver it at that moment? And what was inside it? He pursued every lead with a tenacity that bordered on obsession. He checked the town records, the ferry manifests, the phone logs. Nothing. The stranger was a phantom, a ghost from the storm. The case grew cold, a thin layer of dust settling over the file. But Thomas Reinhardt never forgot it. For 21 years, the mystery of the Walker sisters festered in the heart of Port Remorse. The town moved on, the wounds scabbed over. Elias Walker became a recluse, a ghost himself, spending his days staring at the sea. He never spoke of his daughters or the box. The house fell into disrepair, a crumbling monument to a night of horror. Then, on a crisp, bright morning in October 2023, the world changed. A grizzled fisherman named Silas Vance was trawling in the deep waters about 10 miles off the coast of Port Remorse. The fish were biting, a good sign. But his net snagged on something heavy, something that wasn't a rock or a sunken log. It took him 20 minutes to haul it aboard, his old winch groaning under the strain. What he hauled onto his deck wasn't a fish. It was a wooden box, waterlogged and covered in a thick crust of barnacles and seaweed. But even through the grime, he could see the dark, weathered wood and the glint of a brass lock. The box was locked. Silas Vance, who had grown up on the stories of the Walker sisters, felt a cold finger trace his spine. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He brought it to the town sheriff, a portly man named Jim Galvin, who had taken over the job from Thomas Reinhardt years ago. Sheriff Galvin looked at the box, then at the file that had haunted the department for 2 decades. He made a call. Detective Thomas Reinhardt, now retired and living quietly in a cabin in the woods, was woken from his quiet life. He was an old man now, his dark hair replaced by a silver mane, his sharp eyes sunken but still seeing. When he got the call, a familiar fire reignited in his chest. He knew this was the key. This was the break in the case he'd been waiting for. He arrived at the station and saw the box on a table, the barnacles carefully removed, the wood carefully cleaned. It was identical to the one he'd seen 21 years ago. The same size, the same dark wood, the same tarnished brass lock. But the one Silas had found was older. It had been in the water for a long time. The question that hung in the air, as thick as the smell of brine, was this the same box? Or was it a second one? And if it was the same one Elias Walker had hidden in his basement, how did it end up 10 miles out at sea? The first thing Thomas did was call Elias Walker. It was the hardest call of his life. When he told Elias what had been found, he heard a gasp on the other end of the line, followed by a long, terrible silence. Elias had aged 20 years in that silence. "I never threw it away," Elias finally whispered. "I kept it, in the basement, in a locked trunk. How could it be in the ocean?" It was the same box. This was no longer a cold case. It was an active, unfolding nightmare. The new investigation brought a fresh wave of attention to Port Remorse. Journalists, amateur sleuths, and curious onlookers flooded the town. The podcast, Cold Case Coast, dedicated a season to the Walker sisters, reopening the wounds that had never truly healed. And Thomas Reinhardt, the old detective, was given the authority to lead the investigation once more, with the support of a young, ambitious forensics expert named Dr. R.S. Thorne. The first task was to open the box. The lock was ancient, a simple pin-tumbler mechanism that had rusted shut. It took a specialist hours to pick it, the click of the lock finally echoing in the sterile lab. The lid lifted with a groan, and the moment it opened, a collective gasp filled the room. Inside the box, packed in thick, black, industrial-grade plastic, were 3 distinct items. It wasn't what they expected. It wasn't jewelry or weapons or a letter. There was a child's drawing, aged and yellowed, of a lighthouse on a cliff, surrounded by 3 stick figures. The style was crude, the hand of a young child. On the back, in faded red crayon, was a name: Margot. There was a small, silver locket, tarnished with salt water. Inside, a tiny, faded picture of a woman's face. Not Mrs. Walker, but a younger woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with dark, sad eyes and a kind smile. The locket, upon further examination, had an engraving on the back: "For my dearest C." And then there was the third item. A piece of paper, folded so tightly it felt like cardboard. When Dr. Thorne carefully unfolded it, they saw it was a map. An old, hand-drawn map of Port Remorse and the surrounding coastline. The lines were intricate, showing landmarks both familiar and forgotten. And there, marked with a red X, was a location not on any official map: a small, unnamed cove just north of the lighthouse. Thomas Reinhardt felt a tremor of excitement and dread. The box was a time capsule, a message from the night of the storm. But who had sent it? And what did it mean? The investigation intensified. Every detail of the box's contents was analyzed. The drawing was dated by the type of paper and crayon to the early 2000s. It was definitely Margot's work. The locket was identified as belonging to a woman named Celeste Vance. She was a name from the past, a ghost in the town's memory. And the map pointed directly to the shoreline. The town was buzzing. Theories flew around like the gulls in a storm. Was it a message from the girls? Did they leave clues for someone to find? Or was it planted by their abductor, a taunting piece of a psychotic puzzle? The red X on the map became the center of the world. Thomas organized a search party. He had a crew of volunteer divers, experienced searchers, and the local police. They combed the unnamed cove, the water cold and dark. They used sonar, metal detectors, and underwater cameras. The search was grueling. The rocks were treacherous, the water murky. Days went by. The locals began to whisper. "They're never going to find anything," they said. "It's a ghost story." But Thomas wouldn't give up. He felt it in his bones. He felt a connection to the case that was almost spiritual. He spent his nights staring at the map, tracing the lines, thinking about the girls, the storm, and the man in the rain. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows over the cove, a diver surfaced. His name was Leo, a young man with bright eyes and a trembling voice. He had found something. He wouldn't say what. He just said he had found something. He led them to a small, submerged crevice in the rock face, a place you could barely see if you weren't looking. And there, wedged into the rocks, was a second box. It was smaller than the first, made of metal, sealed tightly against the water. It was heavily encrusted with barnacles, but the metal was intact. It took hours to pry it from its resting place and bring it to the surface. The weight of it was significant, and it gave off a distinct, muffled clink as it was moved. This was another sealed, locked object, but this one had no lock. It had a complex, waterproof seal, the kind used by military or scientific equipment. It was designed to survive a long time underwater. Back in the lab, Dr. Thorne carefully, meticulously, opened the metal box. A wave of stale, trapped air escaped, followed by a smell of rust and salt and something else, something indefinable. Inside, nestled in layers of oilcloth, were more items. A man's wallet, made of dark leather, with a faded ID card inside. The name on the card was a name that had long been forgotten, a name that sent a jolt of electricity through Thomas Reinhardt. It was the name of a man who had been a suspect early in the investigation, a man who had an alibi that seemed solid, a man who had moved away from Port Remorse just a few months after the disappearance. A man named Malcolm Croft. Malcolm Croft had been a lighthouse keeper. He was a strange, solitary figure, a man who kept to himself and had few friends. He had been questioned in the initial investigation, mostly because he had access to the cove and was seen near the Walker house on the night of the storm. But he had a rock-solid alibi. He had been working the night shift at the lighthouse, and his logs showed he never left the grounds. The storm had been so intense, he said, he couldn't have gone anywhere. But here was his wallet, sealed in a box at the bottom of a cove, found with the map. The next item in the box was a woman's glove, a single, dainty, white kid leather glove, with a small pearl button. It was elegant, expensive, the kind of glove a lady would wear to church or a formal dinner. It was nothing like anything the Walker girls owned. It was an anomaly. And then, the most disturbing find of all, a piece of cloth, stained and worn. It was a piece of a dress, a calico fabric with a small, faded floral pattern. It was the same pattern as the dress Margot had been wearing on the night of the storm. The case had just exploded. Thomas Reinhardt's mind was racing. Malcolm Croft, the lighthouse, the wallet, the glove, the map, the boxes. It was a web, a complex, twisted web that was slowly tightening around a truth that had been buried for 21 years. The first step was to find Malcolm Croft. He had left Port Remorse abruptly in the winter of 2003. He had sold his house, a small cottage near the lighthouse, and vanished. There were no records of him buying another property. His trail had gone cold. His family, a distant cousin in Maine, said they hadn't seen him in 20 years. He might as well have been swallowed by the sea. Thomas became obsessed with Croft's story. He went through his old employment records, his bank statements, his personal correspondence. He found a man who was deeply in debt, a man who had been in a long-running, bitter legal battle over a property he claimed his family owned. The property in question was a small piece of land next to the lighthouse, land that had been sold off by the government decades ago. He had lost the case. He was bitter, angry, and desperate. Thomas also found a connection between Croft and Celeste Vance. Celeste Vance had been a wealthy widow who lived in a grand house on the hill overlooking the town. She had a reputation for being a recluse, a woman of great fortune and deep secrets. The locket had been hers, and she was Malcolm Croft's aunt. He was her heir, and when she died, just a year after the storm, she left everything to him. Her entire fortune. Suddenly, a motive emerged. Croft was in debt, he had lost his legal battle, and he was facing financial ruin. But if his aunt were to die, he would inherit a fortune. And Celeste Vance had died of a heart attack in her sleep, a peaceful death at the age of 72. It was ruled natural causes. But in light of the new evidence, everything was suspect. Thomas dug deeper. He found a series of letters between Celeste Vance and a young woman. The young woman was the mother of the girls. Eleanor, Clara, and Margot's mother, a woman named Sarah Walker. The letters were hidden in a compartment in Celeste's house, which Thomas discovered in the property records. They had been hidden, almost certainly, by Malcolm Croft when he inherited the house. But he had missed them. The letters were a revelation. They told a story of a secret friendship, a bond between two very different women. Sarah Walker, the fisherman's wife, and Celeste Vance, the wealthy widow. They had met at a charity event years ago. Sarah had a gift for making people feel heard, for listening to their troubles. Celeste, in her loneliness, had grown deeply fond of her. She became the girls' unofficial godmother, showering them with gifts and affection. The letters also revealed something else. Celeste had witnessed a dark secret. She had seen Malcolm Croft on the night of the storm. She had seen him walking away from the Walker house just as the storm hit its peak. She had seen him, a dark figure, emerging from the darkness, his coat soaked with rain. And in her letters to Sarah, she confessed her fear. She wrote that he had been obsessed with the lighthouse, obsessed with the land he felt was rightfully his, and that she had seen a darkness in his eyes. She wrote that she was afraid of him, and that she was going to change her will. She was going to leave her fortune to Sarah and her daughters. And then, 2 weeks later, she was dead. The letters placed Malcolm Croft at the scene of the crime on the night of the disappearance, and they gave him a powerful motive to murder his aunt. But the murder of the girls? Why? Thomas theorized it was a crime of opportunity, a moment of pure malice and fear. Croft had been at the Walker house to confront Sarah about his inheritance, maybe to threaten her, to get her to influence Celeste to change her will back. The storm was the perfect cover. He arrived, probably through the kitchen door, and found the girls. Maybe he argued with Sarah. Maybe he was seen. The storm was raging. He was panicked. In a fit of rage, he killed or incapacitated her, and the girls were witnesses. He couldn't let them live. But where were the bodies? And where was Malcolm Croft? The metal box found in the cove was the key. Thomas and his team spent weeks analyzing the seal, the contents. And the seal, Dr. Thorne discovered, was a custom-made pressure seal, the kind you'd use to keep a depth gauge or a scientific instrument safe. It was designed to survive long-term submersion. This wasn't a box thrown into the sea. This was a box intentionally placed there, to be found, or to be lost forever. Thomas had a startling realization. The box was a confession. It was Croft's confession, left at the scene of the crime, or at the place where he would meet his own end. He returned to the map. The red X marked the cove where the metal box was found. The box contained Croft's wallet, a woman's glove, and a piece of Margot's dress. It was a neat, damning package. He had left his signature. But why would he do that? Why leave a confession in a waterproof box at the bottom of the sea? And then Thomas remembered a detail about Malcolm Croft's past. Before he was a lighthouse keeper, he had been a treasure hunter. A deep-sea salvage diver. He had spent years exploring the coast of Florida, searching for shipwrecks and Spanish gold. He knew how to dive. He knew how to work with pressure seals. He knew how to hide things at sea. It was possible he had faked his own death. He had been a diver. He could have disappeared into the water. He could have had an escape plan. A boat hidden in the cove. A way to get to the mainland. The investigation shifted. If Croft was alive, he was a fugitive. Thomas put out a nationwide alert, but he knew it was a long shot. Croft was a ghost, a professional at disappearing. But the deeper Thomas dug, the more he realized the truth was even stranger than he had imagined. He went back to the first box, the wooden one found by the fisherman. He looked at the child's drawing, the locket, and the map. He realized that the map wasn't just a location for the second box. It was a treasure map. A map to the truth. The path the map described wasn't just to the cove. It led through the cove, to a specific point on the shore. It led to a secret cave, a small fissure in the rock that was only accessible at low tide. The cave had been sealed off by a rockfall years ago. But now, with the map and the metal box as a guide, Thomas knew exactly where to dig. He organized a second expedition. They cleared the rocks from the entrance. The cave was dark, damp, and smelled of salt and decay. And there, in the deepest part of the cave, they found it. A third box. This one was a large, wooden chest, heavily reinforced with iron bands. It was rotting, but the iron held. They pried it open, and inside, they found the most devastating piece of evidence of all. The remains. Partial skeletal remains of 3 bodies, wrapped in tarps and sealed in plastic. The clothes were intact, the floral dress, the simple jeans, the sweater Eleanor had been wearing. The identities were confirmed by dental records. They were the Walker sisters. The discovery of the remains brought the town of Port Remorse to its knees. The grief that had been held in check for 21 years came flooding back, a wave of pure agony. Elias Walker was brought to the scene. He looked at the remains, the small, broken bones of his daughters, and he wept. He wept for the first time in 21 years. Thomas Reinhardt stood in the cave, a feeling of profound sorrow and relief washing over him. He had found them. He had found the truth. But the story was far from over. The most important question remained. Who had put them there? And was the man they found, Malcolm Croft, the killer? The path to the answer was a maze, and the walls kept closing in. Thomas was digging through Croft's personal belongings when he found an old photograph, dated 1985. It was a group shot of a diving expedition. Croft was there, smiling, his arm around another young man. A man who looked familiar. A man Thomas had seen in the town records. His name was Arthur Vance. He was Celeste's son. He had died years ago in a diving accident off the coast of Florida. Thomas looked at the photograph again. Arthur Vance had been Croft's best friend. They had been partners in the salvage business. They had been inseparable, and then Arthur died in a mysterious accident. His body was never recovered. It was ruled a drowning. Thomas began to connect the dots. He saw a pattern. Arthur Vance had died, leaving his mother, Celeste, as the sole inheritor of the family fortune. Malcolm Croft was her heir after him. But if Arthur had died, Croft was next in line, unless she changed her will. And she did. She changed it to leave everything to Sarah Walker and her daughters. Croft was being cut out. He was being erased, and he had a history of accidents, of people dying and leaving him with everything he wanted. The evidence began to paint a horrifying picture. Malcolm Croft wasn't just the killer of the Walker sisters. He was a serial killer, a man who had been systematically murdering his way to a fortune. He had killed his best friend, Arthur Vance. He had killed his aunt, Celeste Vance. And he had killed the Walker sisters. But where was the proof? Everything was circumstantial. The wallet, the map, the glove, the letters. They were all pieces of the puzzle, but they didn't show him holding the weapon, didn't show him in the act. Thomas needed more. He needed a confession. He went back to the letters Celeste had written to Sarah. In one of them, she described a specific event. "I saw Malcolm tonight," she wrote. "He was at the lighthouse. He was carrying a large, dark bag. He looked strange. He looked like he was hiding something." The letter was dated a week before the storm. Thomas now knew what was in the bag. It was the second box, the metal box, the one he had sealed and hidden in the cove. The one that would, years later, be found and used to incriminate him. Thomas, in a flash of insight, understood the nature of the evidence. Croft was a narcissist, a man who believed he was smarter than everyone else. He was the one who had placed the second box in the cove. He was the one who had set the stage for a future investigation. He wanted to control the narrative. He wanted to be found out, on his terms, in his time. He was a puzzle maker, and the puzzle was his life. He had left a trail of breadcrumbs, each one leading to the next, culminating in the cave. But why? Why would he leave evidence pointing directly to him? The answer came from a final piece of the puzzle, a piece that had been hiding in plain sight. One of the photos found in Celeste's house was a picture of 3 young girls on a beach. Eleanor, Clara, and Margot, playing with a young boy. The boy was Arthur Vance Jr., Celeste's grandson. In the background of the photo, watching them, was a man. A man with a dark hat and a long coat. It was Malcolm Croft. The investigation also revealed that Croft had a history of violence. His ex-wife, a woman he had married and divorced years before, had filed a restraining order against him. She spoke of his obsessive, controlling nature, his rages, his need for control. He was a man who took what he wanted and destroyed anyone who got in his way. But the most damning piece of evidence came from an old diary Arthur Vance Jr. had kept as a teenager. He had written about his great-uncle, Malcolm Croft. He wrote of how his uncle had always been obsessed with the lighthouse, and how he would often speak of the other lighthouse, the one that was supposed to be on the island, the one that never existed. He wrote that his uncle was obsessed with a story, an old legend about a phantom lighthouse that appeared only during storms, a beacon that led ships to their doom. Thomas had been at the door. He had given them the box. He had started the tragedy. The narrative had been a fabrication. Malcolm Croft had been a childhood friend of Sarah Walker's. He had known her, had known the family. He had been part of their lives for years. The night of the storm, he was there to see the girls. He was there to say goodbye. He knew he was leaving, going on the run. But why the box? Why the message? The answer was in the cave. In the remains. Among the fragments of bone and fabric, Thomas found a small, torn piece of paper. It was a piece of a letter, written in a child's hand. It read, "For Clara, for the truth." It was Margot's handwriting. Thomas realized the terrible truth. The box wasn't a confession from the killer. It was a message from the victims. The girls had known they were in danger. They had known what was going to happen. They had left a trail of clues for someone, anyone, to find. They had hidden the first box, the wooden one, as a decoy. They had hidden the map. They had left a message. And then they had gone out into the storm to face their fate. The final pieces of the puzzle came together in a brilliant, tragic flash. Malcolm Croft wasn't the killer. He was the protector. He was the man who had been trying to save them. The night of the storm, the girls had discovered a terrible secret. They had found their father's hidden journals. They had discovered that Elias Walker had been a deeply troubled man, a man with a violent temper and a history of abuse. He had been the one who had killed their mother. The storm had been the perfect cover. He had staged her death as an accident, a drowning. The girls had confronted him that night. They had threatened to go to the police. In a fit of rage, Elias had snapped. He had killed his own daughters and hidden their bodies in the cave, a place he knew intimately from his years as a fisherman. He had then fabricated the story of the man in the rain, the box, the storm, a story to misdirect the police. The evidence was all there, now that they knew what to look for. The gouges on the back door matched a specific set of tools in Elias's workshop. The storm damage was localized, the kitchen was destroyed, but the rest of the house was intact. It was a staged crime scene. The real struggle had happened in the kitchen, but it was a struggle between the girls and their father, not a stranger. The three items in the box, the drawing, the locket, and the map, were a message from beyond the grave. They were the truth, hidden for 21 years, waiting for someone to find them. The fisherman had done exactly what they had intended. He had brought the box to the surface. Thomas Reinhardt had solved the case. He had found the missing girls, but in doing so, he had uncovered a tragedy far darker than he could ever have imagined. Elias Walker was still alive, a broken, haunted old man, living in the same house where he had murdered his own children. He was a monster, but a monster who had spent his life in a prison of his own making, tormented by the memory of what he had done. The story of the Walker sisters was a story of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of secrets. It was a story that would haunt Port Remorse for generations to come. The storm had come, and it had taken everything. But the truth, finally, had emerged from the deep.